Whitby, in the year of 1823, was a place where the sea ruled every life. The harbor breathed salt and sorrow, its ships rising and falling with the tide like weary beasts. The fishermen spoke of storms with the same reverence as they did of God, and the townsfolk carried secrets as though they were heirlooms. It was in this narrow, wind-battered town that a girl named Eleanor lived, barely 14, yet already pressed into a fate that no child should ever know. Her father, once a man of decent means, had lost everything. The sea had swallowed his ships, his ventures rotted under debt, and with each passing week, the collectors pressed harder. In those days, a family's honor was little more than a currency, and honor could be traded away with the most fragile of tokens, a daughter's life. The bargain was made in a low-lit room above the inn on Church Street. Her father, with trembling hands, signed away his child to a man twice his age. This man, a ship merchant whose fortune was bound in iron chains and cargo holds, had no use for love. What he wanted was property, permanence, a bride young enough to be molded into obedience. Eleanor's fate was sealed not by choice, but by a man's ink-stained signature, and the silent nod of neighbors who whispered that such things were only natural. On the morning of her wedding, Whitby was wrapped in fog. The church bell tolled with an eerie hollowness, as though it mourned what was about to take place. Eleanor wore white, though the dress hung awkwardly on her thin frame, a costume of womanhood draped upon a child. Her face, pale as driftwood, betrayed no joy. There was no procession of laughter, no scent of flowers, only the salt of the sea carried in by the wind and the scraping of shoes on stone. The groom stood waiting at the altar, tall and stern, his expression carved from stone. He did not look at her as one might look upon a bride. He studied her as one inspects a purchase, testing its worth, calculating its use. The congregation sat in silence, some shifting uncomfortably, others staring with cold detachment. None intervened. None ever did. When the vows were spoken, Eleanor's voice cracked, barely a whisper. The groom's words, steady and forceful, bound her with the weight of chains unseen. The ring, a simple band of gold, was pushed onto her finger with such force that it left a mark on her skin. The priest's blessing carried no warmth. And when the bell tolled again, she was no longer Eleanor the child. She was Eleanor the wife, Eleanor the debt repaid. Afterward, the townspeople gathered in the square. Some gossiped, others averted their eyes, but all felt the same quiet relief. One man's burden had been lifted, and a girl's innocence had been bartered away. It was, they told themselves, the way of the world. Yet behind closed doors, whispers carried on the sea breeze. They called her the cursed bride, though none could yet explain why. Perhaps it was the way she did not cry, nor rage, nor plead, but stood silent, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if she were already listening to voices carried from beyond. The merchant's house awaited her. It loomed above the harbor, dark windows staring out like watchful eyes. Inside, the corridors stretched long and narrow, smelling of dust and brine. Servants moved quietly, as if fearing to disturb the silence. In that house, laughter was forbidden, and joy had long since died. Eleanor crossed the threshold as a child, but the door closed behind her with the finality of a tomb. Night fell heavy upon Whitby, and the sea roared against the cliffs. In her chamber, Eleanor lay awake, her wedding gown crumpled beside her like a shed skin. The bed was vast, cold, and unwelcoming. Outside, the gulls screamed, and the waves struck the rocks with merciless rhythm. She stared into the dark and understood, with the clarity of one too young to endure such knowledge, that her childhood had been buried not in the ground, but within stone walls and iron vows. It was here, in this union forged not by love, but by desperation, that the legend began. The merchant's house stood apart from Whitby's narrow streets, perched on the slope that overlooked both harbor and graveyard. Its walls were of dark stone, slick with sea mist, and its chimneys spat smoke that drifted low, as though even the fire inside had no strength to rise. For generations it had belonged to the Blackthorne family, merchants who trafficked not only in cargo, but in reputation. It was said no deal in Whitby was struck without a Blackthorne hand somewhere in the bargain. Yet what wealth had once filled its halls was long gone, lost to reckless ventures and ships that never returned. What remained was the house itself, heavy with shadows and stories, a place that seemed less like a home than a mausoleum for memory. Eleanor entered that house on the day of her wedding, her footsteps soft upon the worn floors. The servants glanced at her with curiosity, but none smiled, none welcomed. Their silence was not cruelty, but habit. In this house, warmth had no place. The walls absorbed laughter, the corridors swallowed song, and each room seemed to sigh with the weight of things unspoken. Eleanor, who had never before lived beyond the modest rooms of her father's cottage, felt the vastness of the house pressing in upon her, the silence filling her ears until it rang louder than any church bell. Her husband, Mr. Blackthorne, wasted little time in demonstrating her role. The ceremony had ended in the church, but the contract it bound was only beginning. That evening he spoke to her not as one might speak to a bride, but as a master to a servant. She was to keep herself within the house unless given leave, to speak only when spoken to attend to her duties without complaint. What duties she did not know, for no one explained them. The ambiguity was deliberate. It left her perpetually uncertain, fearful of fault, and in that fear, obedient. Her chamber was high in the northern wing, a narrow room with a small window that looked toward the graveyard by St. Mary's Church. At night, when the mist crept inland, the headstones seemed to rise out of the fog, rows upon rows of pale markers reaching like teeth through the earth. She did not yet fear them, for she had not yet understood what they meant. But she did notice, as she lay in the cold bed, that the graves never seemed to rest. Shapes flickered between the stones, whispers carried on the wind, and sometimes, though she told herself it was imagination, she heard her name carried faintly across the yard. Eleanor. The servants, though silent in her presence, whispered among themselves. They called her the Lamb, for she was small, timid, and doomed to be led where others willed. Some pitied her, others merely watched, but none interfered. For in the Blackthorne house, interference meant dismissal, and dismissal meant ruin. A place had been made for her in their quiet hierarchy, and that place was beneath even the youngest scullery maid. She was mistress only in name. In truth, she was another possession of the house, no more regarded than the faded drapes or the cracked tiles by the hearth. Her husband departed frequently, leaving her alone within the walls. He traveled to London, to Hull, to Scarborough, so he said, though the servants whispered he spent more time in taverns than in counting houses. Eleanor did not ask. Questions were dangerous. Silence was safer. Days bled into weeks, and weeks into months, each one marked by sameness. She woke before dawn, ved quietly through the house, sat at her embroidery without guidance, and lay awake at night listening to the sea. It was during those sleepless nights that the house began to reveal itself. She noticed first the creaks, the footsteps that seemed to cross the corridor though no one was there. Then the whispers, faint, indistinct, like the murmur of a congregation behind a closed door. Once, she swore she heard weeping, a sound so soft it might have been mistaken for wind, yet it came from the walls beside her bed. She told no one. Who would have listened? The house was old, they would say. Houses groaned, winds howled, birds nested in chimneys. But Eleanor began to see more than she heard. In the half-light of dawn, when the first rays of sun crept through her window, she saw movement at the corner of her room, a shadow that did not belong to her, a figure that lingered too long before dissolving, She told herself it was nothing, but when she rose to pray by the window, her breath clouded in the air though no frost lay outside. In Whitby, people spoke cautiously of the Blackthorn house. Fishermen passing beneath its cliffside shadow made the sign of the cross. Children dared each other to run to its gates at dusk, but never touched the iron bars. Old women muttered of curses, of brides who entered that house never to be seen smiling again. Eleanor heard none of these tales, for she was kept within. But she began to sense what others already knew. The house was not merely stone and wood. It carried something else. Something waiting. Her isolation deepened. When she tried to befriend the maids, they avoided her. When she attempted to speak at supper, her husband silenced her with a glance. Even her father did not visit. For what father seeks the sight of the debt he sold? Alone, Eleanor turned inward, her mind the only companion in the silence. Yet the mind, when left to wander in such halls, does not remain steady. It strays. It invents. Or perhaps it listens to what others ignore. The weeks that followed dragged upon Eleanor like lead weights. The air within the house grew heavier with each passing day, as if the walls themselves pressed closer, suffocating her. Though her husband was gone often, his presence lingered in the smallest of cruelties, habits instilled in the servants who followed his example. She was spoken to curtly, obeyed only when she repeated commands twice, and served last at her own table. It was a ritual of humiliation, subtle but ceaseless, designed to remind her of her place. Her husband returned from his voyages at irregular intervals, sometimes gone a week, sometimes 3, always unannounced. When he entered the house, the silence grew sharper, as though even the stones feared him. His voice carried not affection, but judgment, delivered in measured tones that cut her small rebellions to pieces. A crooked stitch in her embroidery was met with scorn. A candle left burning too long was called wasteful. Her reluctance to meet his eye was labeled insolence. Each rebuke was minor, yet they accumulated, lodging themselves like thorns beneath her skin. The townsfolk watched from afar. When Eleanor appeared in church, sitting at her husband's side, her gaze downcast, the villagers whispered. Some pitied her. Some condemned her. A few muttered that she must have brought such misfortune upon herself. For why else would God bind a child to a man with such coldness in his eyes? But most turned their heads. A marriage was a marriage after all, and who were they to interfere with the vows of the Blackthorn family? One afternoon, when the mist lay low over Whitby and the harbor bells tolled, Eleanor ventured into the marketplace with the maid assigned to her. It was her first time beyond the gates in weeks. The cobblestones glistened with damp, and the cries of vendors echoed off the narrow streets. For a fleeting moment, she felt as though she were still a girl, wandering with her father, before debts and signatures had stolen her future. But that illusion shattered quickly. A group of women, faces lined by hardship and suspicion, paused in their bartering to stare at her. They whispered behind their hands, their eyes never leaving Eleanor's pale figure. One laughed, not kindly, and another murmured a word that struck her heart like a lash. Child wife. The phrase followed her down the street, clinging like a curse. Child wife. A label that erased her name, herself, reducing her to a transaction spoken of with contempt. That evening, as she sat by the fire, her husband's shadow falling long across the room, she repeated the word silently, over and over, until it seemed less like a cruel remark and more like a truth etched into her very skin. Humiliation became her constant companion. At supper, her husband entertained his associates in the dining hall. Eleanor sat at the far end of the table, her plate filled but untouched, for the men spoke as though she were invisible. They laughed over trade, cursed rival merchants, planned voyages, and when the talk turned to wives, they spoke of them as livestock, as burdens, as property. One guest, emboldened by drink, glanced down the table and said with a smirk, "At least Blackthorn has made an investment that will last him decades." The laughter that followed echoed in Eleanor's ears long after the men had gone, long after the plates had been cleared, long after the silence had reclaimed the house. Alone in her chamber, she began to keep a small book hidden beneath the loose floorboard near her bed. In it, she wrote the words she could never say aloud. She wrote of the humiliation, of the loneliness, of the way her body felt less her own each day. She wrote of the house, too, of the whispers she could not explain and the shadows that lingered too long in her periphery. Her words were desperate, fevered, a lifeline in ink. Yet even the act of writing carried its own danger, for discovery would bring punishment. So she hid the book, pressing it beneath the boards as though burying her soul in a shallow grave. And still the house pressed in. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch her more closely. The nameless woman she had once questioned appeared sharper now in the flicker of candlelight, her painted eyes following Eleanor's movements. The air grew colder in her chamber, a chill that no fire seemed able to dispel. The servants crossed themselves more often, muttering of drafts and dampness, but their glances betrayed unease. One night, when her husband returned in a foul temper, he summoned Eleanor to the parlor. She stood before him, hands clasped tightly, while he measured her with those stone-cold eyes. Without a word, he placed a heavy silver chain around her neck, the clasp snapping shut like the lock of a cell. "A wife must bear her husband's mark," he said. She touched the chain with trembling fingers, its weight pressing against her collarbone. It was not jewelry. It was ownership. Eleanor lay awake that night, the chain biting into her skin, her breath catching against the metal. She whispered to herself that she was not his possession, that she was still Eleanor. Yet the voice in her mind, that insidious whisper born of humiliation and silence, replied otherwise. It told her she was nothing but debt repaid, a vessel bound to a man who would never see her as human. And in the stillness of that night, as the wind howled around the Blackthorn house and the sea pounded the cliffs, another whisper rose, faint but clear from the darkness beside her bed, a voice not her own. Winter returned to Whitby with cruel winds, rattling shutters and filling the harbor with a restless tide. The year had passed in slow torment for Eleanor, a cycle of absence and return, neglect and humiliation, chains both visible and unseen. Her 13th year had bled into her 14th autumn. Yet no celebration had marked it, no recognition that she had crossed the fragile border between child and woman. For her husband, she was neither. She was only his possession. The silver chain around her neck had become permanent, the clasp locked so tightly that even her attempts to pry it free left her fingers raw. At meals, it gleamed beneath the candlelight, drawing the attention of guests who smirked knowingly, but said nothing. It was the unspoken mark of ownership, the kind no sermon could sanctify, and no vow could cleanse. But if the chain bound her body, it was the house that bound her soul. Blackthorn House grew colder with each passing night. The servants avoided the upper corridors, muttering that the air there was wrong, that the shadows lengthened even when the lamps were full. Eleanor, left alone in those halls, heard the creak of unseen footsteps, the low sigh of a voice calling her name. At first, she told herself it was imagination, the mind reaching for sound in the silence. But when she began to answer, when she whispered into the dark, "Who's there?" the silence answered back. One evening, as the storm lashed against the windows and the servants huddled in the kitchen below, Eleanor sat in her chamber staring at the portrait of the nameless woman. The eyes seemed sharper than before, the mouth drawn tighter, the pallor of the paint drained to an unnatural gray. She whispered her thoughts aloud, the kind she never dared put into her secret book. "I cannot endure this. I am nothing but his ghost. Tell me, what am I to do?" The reply was not spoken, yet it filled the room. A whisper in her mind, soft but insistent. "You are not his." The words shook her. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trembling, but the whisper came again, stronger this time, like a current beneath her skin. You belong to me. That night she dreamed of the sea. She walked along the cliffs in her white nightdress, the chain dragging behind her like an anchor. The waves crashed below, black and furious, and from them rose a hand, pale, dripping, clawed, reaching for her. She woke with a cry, her nightdress damp with sweat, the chain cutting into her throat. And at the foot of her bed, in the shifting candlelight, she swore she saw a figure, a woman in a bridal gown, the veil torn, the bodice stained dark. The figure lifted her head, and Eleanor glimpsed eyes that glowed faintly, like embers in the ash. When she blinked, the figure was gone, but the scent of salt lingered in the room, and the whisper remained, curling in her ear like smoke. Not forever. Her husband returned days later, his temper sharpened by drink and losses at sea. He demanded supper served at midnight, and when Eleanor faltered in pouring his wine, he struck the cup from her hand. The red liquid splashed across her gown like blood. His laughter was cruel, the servant's silence complicit. In that moment, humiliation twisted into something else, a quiet, simmering rage. That night, Eleanor went to her chamber and pried open the floorboard where her secret book lay hidden. She wrote feverishly, the ink smearing with her tears. She wrote of chains and cruelty, of the portrait that watched her, of the whisper that promised release, and for the first time, she wrote of murder, not as fantasy, not as sin, but as possibility. She signed her name at the bottom of the page, not Eleanor Blackthorne, but Eleanor Whitby, reclaiming her father's name as though stripping away the ownership forced upon her. The next day, when her husband mocked her once more before his guests, forcing her to play the piano until her trembling hands struck wrong notes, she lifted her gaze to him and held it. For the first time in their marriage, she did not lower her eyes. Something in her stare unsettled him. He scowled, muttered, and turned away. But Eleanor knew then that the power of humiliation was waning. A seed had taken root. At night, she listened to the whispers, not with fear, but with intent. They spoke of liberation, of vengeance, of an ending written in blood and salt. And when the storm winds howled around Blackthorne House, Eleanor no longer cowered beneath her covers. She stood at the window, the chain gleaming at her throat, and whispered back into the dark. Not forever. The house seemed to answer, the timbers groaning as if in assent. Somewhere deep within its walls, a door creaked open without human hand. The breaking point had come. The weeks that followed were thick with silence. Whitby's harbor froze under a sheath of winter ice, the fishing boats locked in place as though the sea itself had stopped breathing. Blackthorne House, with its shuttered windows and smoke-blackened chimneys, seemed less a home than a tomb. Within its walls, Eleanor moved quietly, like a shadow among shadows, her body frail, but her mind burning. Her husband's rages had grown unpredictable. Some nights he returned drunk, hurling insults that slurred into nonsense. Other nights he did not return at all, his absence stretching till dawn, leaving the house in a brittle unease. The servants carried on their tasks with hollow faces, avoiding her eyes, yet they could not avoid the sound. The faint whispers that bled through the corridors when Eleanor walked past. They pretended not to hear, but Eleanor knew they did. She saw their hands tremble when they passed her bread, saw them cross themselves when they thought her gaze was elsewhere. The whispers, once faint, had become distinct. No longer were they only echoes in her head. They spoke in words, clear and deliberate. Eleanor. Eleanor. At first she resisted, too terrified of what she was becoming. But one evening, alone in her chamber with the portrait's eyes fixed upon her, she asked aloud, "What do you want of me?" The answer came swift, a voice like the tide withdrawing over sharp stones. "I want what you want. Freedom." Her heart pounded. She clutched the chain at her throat, as if it might protect her, but the clasp burned cold against her skin. She whispered back, "How?" The candle guttered, the shadows deepened, and in that tremor of flame she saw her. The woman in white, the bride whose veil trailed with seaweed, whose lips were blue with drowned silence. She stood at the foot of Eleanor's bed, her head tilted, her eyes glimmering with a terrible kindness. When she spoke, it was not through her mouth, but through the air itself. "Give me your pain, and I will give you your power." Eleanor's hands shook. She thought of her father, who had sold her like livestock. She thought of her husband, whose laughter bruised her more deeply than his hand. She thought of the years stretched before her, endless nights of humiliation, endless winters of silence, and something hardened within her. "I accept," she whispered. The figure moved closer. Eleanor felt the air grow heavy, as if the room itself had taken breath. The woman reached out her hand, white, dripping, inhuman, and touched Eleanor's chain. The silver hissed as though plunged into flame. Eleanor cried out, falling to her knees, but she did not let go. She gripped the chain, even as it burned, even as her vision swam. When she opened her eyes, the woman was gone. But the chain was no longer cold metal. It pulsed faintly against her throat, as though it had become part of her, fused with the beat of her heart. She touched it and felt not restraint, but strength. That night, she dreamed again. Not of drowning, but of standing tall upon the cliffs of Whitby, the sea raging beneath her. The chain around her neck glowed like molten silver, and the drowned bride stood at her side, veil lifted, face both beautiful and ruined. Together, they gazed at the storm. Together, they smiled. When Eleanor woke, the decision had settled in her bones like marrow. She no longer feared the whispers. She no longer prayed for deliverance. She had made a pact, and in that pact, she had found purpose. From that day forward, she began to watch her husband differently. She memorized his routines, noted the way he favored wine at supper, the way he left his candle burning low when he fell asleep in his study. She watched how he stumbled when drunk, how he leaned upon the stair rail with unsteady weight. These details, once meaningless, now gleamed with possibility. And always, in the silence, the whisper encouraged her. Soon. The change was not immediate, but subtle, like frost creeping across a window pane. Eleanor's posture grew straighter, her voice steadier. The servants, once accustomed to her meekness, now found themselves lowering their eyes before hers. Even her husband noticed. When he returned one evening, reeking of ale, he paused mid-insult, unsettled by the way she looked at him, not with fear, but with a cold and steady calm. He muttered, cursed, and waved her off. But Eleanor knew he had felt it. The shift. Her nights were no longer plagued by helpless dreams. The visions now guided her. She saw flashes of the drowned bride standing beside her, whispering instructions, showing her places in the house where the floorboards creaked, where the servants hid their knives, where the shadows lingered longest. Each dream ended the same way. Eleanor's hands stained dark, her husband lying still. The first act came almost without thought. It was a bitter evening when the fire in the great hearth sputtered low. Her husband barked at a young servant boy to fetch wood from the cellar. The boy trembled, dropping the poker in fright, and her husband raised his hand as if to strike. Something in Eleanor broke. She stepped between them, calm as ice, and said, "Leave him, I will fetch it." Her husband smirked, amused at her sudden defiance. "Then do it," he sneered, shoving the empty goblet into her hand. "And bring more wine while you're at it." Eleanor descended to the cellar, the chain at her throat thrumming like a pulse. The drowned bride's voice was waiting for her in the dark. Tonight. Begin tonight. Her hand drifted over the bottles of wine, the dusty barrels of ale. She found a vial, hidden among cobwebs, containing a bitter tincture once used by the steward for sick cattle. She had seen him mix it years ago. To put down a heifer writhing in pain. Just a drop had ended its life. She took it. When she returned to the dining hall, her husband was in his cups, laughing cruelly at his own stories, while the servants served him in silence. She poured the wine into his goblet, steady as stone, and added a single drop of the tincture. Her heart hammered as she set it before him. He lifted the cup, grinned at her, and drank deep. The minutes that followed stretched like hours. He coughed once, then again, the laughter catching in his throat. His face paled, his eyes watered. He slammed the goblet onto the table, glaring at her as though he knew. But before he could rise, before he could strike, his body betrayed him. He slumped back in his chair, breath ragged, lips frothing. The servants gasped, frozen in terror. Eleanor did not move. She stood watching, her face unreadable, as his body convulsed once, twice, then stilled. Silence fell. And then, the whisper, "Well done." But the silence did not last. The steward, a loyal man despite his fear, rushed forward, pressing his ear to his master's chest. He looked up, pale and shaken, and muttered, "Alive. Barely." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. The tincture had weakened him, but not finished the deed. Her husband was carried to his chamber, muttering curses even in delirium. The servants prayed he would survive. Eleanor remained silent. She knew now that the whispers demanded more than a single act of chance. They demanded blood given with intent, not hesitation. That night, as her husband groaned in fevered sleep, Eleanor sat by his bed, watching him twist and sweat. In the flicker of the candlelight, the drowned bride appeared once more, her veil dripping with seawater, her gaze piercing. "You faltered," the spirit said, her voice not cruel but firm. Eleanor clenched the chain at her throat. "No, I tested him. Next time there will be no faltering." The drowned bride's lips curled into a faint smile. "Then you are ready." From that night forward, Eleanor no longer resisted. She planned, she listened, and she waited. The first blood had been drawn, even if it had not yet claimed its life. And Eleanor knew the next attempt would not fail. The days that followed her husband's poisoning were drenched in unease. He survived, but not as before. His body was weaker, his temper sharper, his sleep restless with fits and mutterings. The once boisterous man who returned from sea with booming laughter now lurked through the halls, suspicious of every glance, quick to accuse, quick to strike. Yet in his frailty, Eleanor saw not strength, but opportunity. Blackthorn House had begun to change as well. The servants whispered of cold drafts that swept through sealed corridors, of mirrors that clouded though no breath touched them, of faint sobbing at night, though no one could find its source. One maid swore she saw wet footprints trailing up the staircase, though the ground outside was dry. The steward dismissed these tales as foolishness, but his own hands shook when he lit the candles, and his eyes darted often to Eleanor, as though he feared she was somehow the cause. Eleanor did nothing to deny it. She moved through the halls with a calm that unsettled them more than a nigh rage. Her chain glimmered faintly even in the dark, and those who looked too long swore it pulsed like a vein. Her husband noticed the change most of all. He woke often in the night, shouting at shadows only he could see. "She watches me," he muttered once, clutching at Eleanor's wrist with a fevered hand. "The woman in white. Do you not see her? By the window? There, there." Eleanor turned her head, and for the briefest moment, she did see her. The drowned bride, standing in the corner, veil dripping with seawater, eyes locked not on Eleanor, but on him. Her husband's grip loosened, his face drained of color. "She waits," he whispered hoarsely. "She waits for me." Eleanor did not answer. She only laid a cool hand upon his brow, the picture of wifely duty, though her heart beat with a quiet satisfaction. Outside, the sea raged against the cliffs with unusual violence. Fishermen spoke of storms that rose without warning, capsizing boats in the shallows. The parish priest gave sermons warning of God's judgment, urging repentance, though his gaze often flicked toward Blackthorn House, as if he suspected its walls harbored sin. And then there were the dreams. Eleanor's dreams grew sharper, more vivid. No longer simple whispers, they became visions of acts yet to come. Her husband tumbling down the staircase, his body broken on the stones, his chamber filling with seawater, though the windows were closed, his breath caught in her hands as she pressed the pillow down. Each dream ended with the same sound, the church bells of Whitby tolling, though not for mass, for morning. One night, the drowned bride came to her not in shadow, but in clarity. The veil was gone, revealing a face at once beautiful and ruined, skin pale as bone, lips tinged with the blue of the sea. She sat at Eleanor's bedside like a sister, her voice low and steady. "The storm gathers, child. It will not wait forever." Eleanor, though trembling, nodded. "Tell me how." The spirit reached out, her hand icy. Sting it upon Eleanor's chain. Not poison, not dreams. Blood must answer blood. You must end it with your own hands, or the house will never be yours. Eleanor closed her eyes. The whispers no longer frightened her. The house no longer felt like prison walls, but like walls of a cathedral, consecrated not to God, but to her vengeance. The storm outside battered the cliffs, rain lashing against the windows. Within, Blackthorn House groaned and shuddered, as though it too strained against the weight of its master. Eleanor knew then that her husband's days were numbered. The sea, the house, the spirit, all had aligned. The storm had gathered, and soon it would break. The night came with no warning, though perhaps Eleanor had always known it would. The sky over Whitby blackened early, clouds swollen like bruises, the sea beneath them raging as though it sought to claw the cliffs down stone by stone. By dusk, the first thunder cracked, shaking the windows of Blackthorn House. By midnight, the storm was a beast, rattling shutters, tearing tiles from the roof, howling through every gap in the old stone walls. Inside, the servants huddled in the kitchens, refusing to climb the staircases that groaned under invisible weight. Candles sputtered, shadows leapt, prayers were whispered. They knew something more than weather was at work, though none dared name it. Upstairs, Eleanor stood before her mirror. The candlelight flickered across her face, pale and composed, her dark eyes rimmed with the sleepless fever of resolve. Around her neck, the chain pulsed faintly, as though alive. She lifted her hand to it and whispered, "Tonight." The reply came at once, the voice of the drowned bride curling through the storm. Tonight. Her husband had locked himself in his chamber earlier, muttering of shadows that followed him, of footsteps that echoed his own. He had paced for hours, rinking steadily, his temper unraveling with every swallow. Now he slumped in his chair by the hearth, head heavy, the goblet at his side half spilled across the floorboards. Eleanor entered without knocking. He looked up, eyes red-rimmed, face slack with exhaustion and drink. "What are you doing here?" he barked, though his voice cracked. She stepped closer, her feet silent on the rug. "I came to watch over you." His laugh was bitter, edged with fear. "You, my cursed little wife?" He sneered, though it lacked strength. "You think I don't see it? You think I don't hear her in the halls? The woman, the bride. She waits for me. And you," he jabbed a trembling finger at her, "you brought her." Eleanor tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Perhaps she came for what is owed. The thunder boomed above them, lightning split the sky, and for a heartbeat the chamber was lit as though by fire. In that flash, her husband saw what she saw. The drowned bride standing behind Eleanor, veil torn, eyes blazing with saltwater fury. His face blanched. He stumbled back, chair crashing behind him. "No! No!" he cried, scrambling for the hearth poker. His hands shook too badly to grip it. Eleanor moved forward, calm, steady, as though carried on the tide itself. She reached for the poker, tore it from his grasp with sudden strength, and lifted it high. He fell to his knees. "Eleanor, please!" For a moment, the world slowed. She saw not just him, but every humiliation, every chain, every night she had prayed for deliverance that never came. She felt the weight of the drowned bride's gaze upon her, urging, commanding. And then she brought the iron down. The first blow cracked bone. The second silenced his voice. The third and fourth were not for necessity, but for certainty. For the years stolen, for the innocence bartered away. By the time she stopped, her hands slick with blood, her husband lay still, eyes wide in a final frozen terror. Silence followed, thick and absolute. Even the storm seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor stood over him, chest heaving, the poker clattering to the floor. She lifted her hands, red and trembling, and touched the chain at her throat. For the first time it was cool. Not burning, not binding. Cool and weightless. Behind her, the drowned bride's figure shimmered in the air. Her veil was gone, her face calm, her lips curved in a faint, terrible smile. She inclined her head once, like a queen acknowledging a subject. "It is done." And then she was gone. The thunder broke once more, rain hammering the windows. But the house felt different now. Lighter, as if the storm outside was not destruction, but baptism. Eleanor turned toward the door. The servants would find the body soon enough. Let them whisper. Let them wonder. She was no longer a bride. She was no longer a child. She was Eleanor of Whitby, and she was free. Morning came slowly, though no dawn seemed to pierce the storm. The rain fell in relentless sheets, washing mud across the cobblestones of Whitby, filling gutters until they overflowed, turning the graveyard earth into a mire that clung to every boot and wheel. The town stirred cautiously, for word had already begun to move, whispered from lips pale with shock. Something had happened at Blackthorn House. The servants had been the first to know. They had not slept that night, huddled in the kitchens as the storm rattled the shutters and howled through the chimneys. They heard the screams, muffled, desperate, cut short. They heard the thud of blows, the crash of furniture, the silence that followed like a grave closing. They dared not move until the storm's fury ebbed, until the silence stretched too long to be natural. At dawn, one of them climbed the staircase, each step heavy with dread, and found the chamber door ajar. The master lay sprawled on the floor, face crushed, blood pooled black against the rug. The poker lay beside him, twisted and slick. And near the hearth, as calm as though she had merely tended the fire, sat Eleanor. Her gown was torn, her hands were red, but her expression was composed, almost serene. "I did what was asked of me," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the window where the sea raged beyond. "He is gone now." The servant fled, and within the hour, the whispers had reached the town. By midday, the church bells tolled, not for a wedding or a feast, but for death. The vicar, pale and trembling, led the constables up to Blackthorn House. They found Eleanor still seated, unchanged, her eyes hollow as though emptied by what she had done. When they asked her what had happened, she spoke plainly, her voice steady as stone. "He was cruel. He was cursed. He belonged to the sea. I only gave him back to her." The constables exchanged uneasy glances. For though the crime was plain, the manner of it was less so. They bound her hands, though she did not resist. They led her out into the rain, through the gathered villagers who pressed close, craning for a glimpse of the girl who had become a widow by her own hand. Some gasped, some crossed themselves, some spat. But more than a few lowered their voices and whispered words that would cling to her forever. The cursed bride. At the jail, Eleanor was placed in a cold stone cell. The iron bars echoed with the sea's roar, carried on the wind through cracks in the walls. She sat upon the bench, silent, the chain still at her throat, though the locket hung dull and lifeless now. When the vicar came to her, he urged repentance, confession, the seeking of forgiveness. Eleanor only smiled faintly. Forgiveness. It was not I who sinned, but he who bought me, and he who struck me down each day with his scorn. If there is sin, it lies with him, and with the man who sold me. The vicar recoiled, for her words rang with a conviction that chilled him more than the storm. The trial was swift. In 1823, the law cared little for motive, less still for the hidden cruelties of marriage. A wife who struck her husband down was a wife who had defied both man and God. The evidence was damning, the blood on her hands, the weapon at her side, the silence of servants who dared not defend her. The judge declared her guilty of murder. The sentence was death. Yet the town itself was divided. Some whispered that she was no criminal, but a victim of fate. They spoke of the chain, of the drowned bride, of the curse that clung to the Whitby coast. They said the sea had taken her husband through her hand, just as surely as it had taken the girl who drowned on her wedding day. Others saw only a murderer, a girl too bold, too cold, too unrepentant. The day she was led to the gallows, the crowd filled the square. The storm had passed, but the sky was iron gray, the air heavy as stone. Eleanor walked with steady steps, her face pale but unflinching. When the rope was placed around her neck, she lifted her chin, eyes fixed not on the people, not on the judge, not even on the priest who mumbled prayers, but on the distant horizon where the sea met the sky. A gust of wind swept the square, carrying with it the tang of salt and the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs. And in that moment, many swore they saw a figure in the mist. A woman in a torn veil, watching, waiting. The lever dropped, the rope snapped taut. Eleanor's body swung, her eyes still wide, her lips curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile. The curse had claimed her, but it had not broken her. That night, when her body was taken down and buried in unconsecrated ground at the edge of the churchyard, the tide surged higher than any had seen in years. Waves crashed against the cliffs, breaking stone, swallowing boats, dragging 3 men to their deaths. The villagers whispered that the sea was not yet done, that Eleanor had joined the drowned bride in her vigil, and that together they would haunt Whitby's shores until the debt of blood be Yaredit's sum as fully paid. And so she became not merely a girl, nor a wife, nor even a murderer, but a legend. The cursed bride of Whitby, whose wedding was her doom, whose chains were her gallows, and whose story lingers still in the salt and stone of that bleak coast. The weeks that followed seemed to move in a haze of dread. Each dawn brought with it not relief, but a tightening in Eleanor's chest, as though the very air of the house pressed upon her ribs. Whitby itself seemed altered in her eyes. The harbor that once rang with fishermen's laughter now sounded only of distant echoes. The abbey ruins loomed taller and darker, their shadows stretching across her thoughts like iron bars. Thomas grew quieter, but not gentler. He no longer stormed with open violence each day, but the silence he carried was more dangerous than his rage. He would watch Eleanor from across the room, eyes narrowed, lips moving as if whispering to himself, and she often wondered whether he was speaking to her or to the ghosts of his past. His mother, meanwhile, had turned from bitter remarks to a cold indifference that left Eleanor feeling erased, as though her presence in the house had been reduced to nothing more than a shadow passing by. One evening, Eleanor overheard a conversation in the study. Thomas spoke in low tones with a stranger whose voice she did not recognize. Words like inheritance, dower, and debt filtered through the door. But then came another word that froze her blood. Widow. The way Thomas said it carried not grief, but calculation, as though he considered widowhood a coin to be spent. She pressed a hand to her chest, her breath quickening, a sickening realization dawning that her very existence was being measured against the weight of his fortune. Her body had already begun to betray her. She was frail, thinner than when she had first come to Whitby, her cheeks hollowed from sleepless nights. The house seemed to feed upon her vitality. Every creak of the stairs, every draught that seeped through the stone, drawing strength from her marrow. Yet it was not simply illness that consumed her. It was the terror of living beside a man who appeared to regard her as little more than a tool in his ledger. When Eleanor sought refuge in the town, she found little comfort. The townsfolk, who once greeted her politely, now cast sidelong glances, whispers trailing behind her steps. "The cursed bride," she heard one woman hiss. Another muttered, "She brings death where she walks." It was as though the rumors had shifted, no longer portraying her as a victim, but as the source of the very misfortune that dogged the Whitmore family. Her isolation was nearly complete, and she returned home each time with the bitter knowledge that nowhere in Whitby offered sanctuary. Then came the night she could not forget. A storm lashed against the windows, the sea howling in its fury. Eleanor lay awake in her chamber, staring at the ceiling where shadows twisted like black vines. She heard the slow creak of her door opening, and, in the dim candlelight, saw Thomas standing there. His face was pale, his eyes bright with some dreadful resolve. He said nothing as he crossed the room and placed a vial upon her bedside table. The liquid inside glowed faintly amber, catching the flicker of the flame. "For your sleepless nights," he murmured, though his tone carried no comfort, only the weight of inevitability. He turned and left without another word, the door closing softly behind him. Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for the vial, her reflection warped in the glass. She did not drink, but the knowledge of it being there haunted her through the night. It was not medicine she saw in that bottle, but a choice forced upon her, to swallow and end her suffering by his will, or resist and deface whatever cruelty awaited. By dawn she had not touched the vial, but in her heart, she knew something irreversible had shifted. She was no longer merely a bride imprisoned by cruelty. She was prey in a house where her survival had been weighed, her death prepared. And with that understanding came a terrifying question. How long before the cursed bride of Whitby became the widow her husband so coldly imagined? The days after the vial appeared were unbearable. Eleanor carried it with her like a mark, hidden in her drawer yet never out of her mind. She dared not dispose of it, for Thomas would surely notice. Its presence was a silent threat, a reminder that her husband held her fate in his hands. Each night, she lay awake, the faint rattle of the glass against wood keeping her from sleep, her body stiff with dread. Thomas's behavior became stranger still. He would vanish from the house for hours, sometimes days, returning with the smell of ale and smoke on his coat. Yet when Eleanor looked into his eyes, she saw not drunkenness, but calculation, as though every step he took outside their walls was one piece of a design she could not yet see. Once, she found him in the cellar, poring over old documents by lamplight. When he noticed her, he slammed the papers shut and hissed at her to return upstairs, his hands trembling. The townsfolk grew bolder in their cruelty. Children sang mocking rhymes as she passed, their voices shrill against the salt air. "The cursed bride," they chanted, their faces alight with mischief and fear. Women who once offered a kind word now turned their backs. Even the pastor who had smiled at her during the wedding avoided her gaze when she sat alone in the church pew. To them, Eleanor was no longer a wronged girl, but an omen, a living reminder of some unnamed sin that stained the Whitmore house. In her loneliness, she began to wander the moors at dusk, the air heavy when, The mist, the ground damp beneath her shoes. There she felt the presence of something older than the town's whispers. The wind carried voices that seemed to call her name, faint but insistent. Once, as she lingered near the ruins of the abbey, she thought she saw a figure moving among the stones. A pale woman with dark hair flowing loose, her dress torn as though she had clawed her way out of the earth. Eleanor blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving only the echo of her own heartbeat. When she returned home from these walks, Thomas would watch her closely. His silence deepened, but there was a gleam in his eyes that chilled her more than his anger ever had. It was the look of a man who believed he had already won. One evening, she entered the kitchen to find the vial gone from her drawer. Panic seized her chest. She rushed to her chamber, tearing through her belongings, but it had vanished as though it had never existed. That night, Thomas offered her wine at dinner, his smile thin and joyless. She did not drink. The goblet remained untouched beside her plate, its dark surface reflecting the flicker of the fire. Eleanor began to understand that her only weapon was endurance. If she could resist each trap, if she could survive each silent attack, perhaps she could outlast him. Yet the more she resisted, the heavier the air in the house became. The walls seemed to lean inward, the floors groaned with each step, and the very stones of Whitby appeared to thirst for her despair. It was then that the dreams began. She dreamt of the abbey ruins, but they were whole, their bells tolling across the sea. She stood within their walls, clothed in white, but when she looked down her gown was stained with blood. A man's shadow stretched across the floor toward her, long and distorted. And when she turned, she saw not Thomas but a faceless figure, reaching out with hands of bone. She always woke with a cry, her throat raw, her body trembling, convinced that the dream was not merely her mind's torment, but a vision of the fate closing in. Eleanor was no longer only afraid of her husband. She was afraid of Whitby itself, the town, the people, the moors, the sea, the abbey. All of it seemed bound together in a single unspoken pact, one that demanded her ruin. By the spring of 1824, Eleanor had grown pale as parchment. She moved through the Whitmore house like a ghost already half departed from her body. Servants whispered that they could hear her footsteps at night when she never left her chamber. Others swore they saw her standing in the garden, unmoving for hours, her eyes fixed on the abbey, ruins against the horizon. Yet when asked, Eleanor had no memory of such moments. The town's whispers had grown into stories, repeated and reshaped until they took on lives of their own. Some claimed Eleanor had cursed her husband's fortune, that every failed venture and every coin lost to debt was the result of her presence. Others said she was a witch, bound to the sea's fury, her very breath capable of stirring storms. There were even those who insisted she had died months earlier, and the girl who walked Whitby's lanes was no longer flesh, but a revenant returned to haunt her husband. Thomas, far from defending her, encouraged these tales with his silence. When asked about his wife, he merely shrugged, muttering, "The curse will have its way." The cruel gleam in his eye betrayed a man who had found profit in her suffering. He withdrew further into his schemes, gambling with men from Leeds and Scarborough, selling off what remained of his family's holdings. But beneath his dealings ran the steady current of a single, unspoken expectation: that Eleanor's death would arrive soon enough to settle every debt. One night, Eleanor awoke to a sound that froze her blood, the heavy scrape of wood against stone. She rose from her bed, heart pounding, and followed it down to the cellar. There she found Thomas by lamplight, shoving an old trunk toward the far wall. Sweat glistened on his brow, though the air was cold. When he saw her, he did not flinch, only said in a flat voice, "You should be in bed." She dared to ask, "What are you hiding?" He smiled then, a cruel, humorless smile. "Only what you will soon need." And with that he left, taking the lamp, leaving her in the dark with the faint smell of damp earth and iron pressing against her lungs. Eleanor fled back upstairs, but the words followed her like a noose tightening around her neck. What you will soon need. She did not sleep that night, nor the night after. She began to hear the Abbey's bells in her dreams again, though no bell had rung there in centuries. The townsfolk grew restless with the tales surrounding her. A group of fishermen claimed they saw her standing on the cliff at dawn, her hair whipping in the wind, whispering to the sea. When they approached, she vanished like mist. A seamstress swore Eleanor's reflection did not appear in her mirror when she fitted her gown. These stories spread like fire, and Eleanor, though still alive, became more myth than woman. Yet within her, something began to harden. Fear had eaten her hollow, but in that hollow space a new resolve stirred. If she was to be made into a ghost while still living, then she would learn to wield the terror her name carried. She no longer bowed her head when passing through Whitby. Instead, she met the eyes of those who whispered and watched them flinch. In the market, she lingered near the fishmongers until one dropped his knife, convinced she had cursed his catch. But each act of defiance only stoked Thomas's fury. He struck her once, hard enough to leave her jaw swollen, and warned her never to embarrass him before the town again. Yet Eleanor saw something else in his gaze that night. Not anger alone, but fear. For all his cruelty, for all his plotting, Thomas was a man who had begun to dread the legend his wife had become. The air in the Whitmore house thickened with secrecy. Doors that once stood open were kept locked. Papers lay scattered across Thomas's desk, covered hastily when Eleanor entered. She noticed the way he measured her portions at dinner, the way he poured her drink before his own. Each act, small and deliberate, left her certain that he had woven her death into the very rhythm of her days. The cellar became the heart of her dread. Though she never returned after that night, she could not forget the sight of Thomas pushing the trunk into the shadows. She wondered if he had already prepared a resting place for her, a box in which her body would be hidden until the whispers of Whitby faded. The thought gnawed at her until she could not walk past the stairwell without feeling a chill creep up her spine. One evening, she overheard him speaking again, this time to a man whose voice carried the rasp of age. Through the door she caught fragments of the conversation. Soon, inheritance secured, widowhood, no suspicion. Then came the sound of coins clinking together, and Thomas's low laugh. Eleanor pressed her ear to the wood, her whole body trembling. Her name was not spoken, but she knew. They spoke of her as though she were already gone. Her health declined swiftly. The sleepless nights, the hollow meals, the constant terror left her thin and weak. She often felt faint, her hands trembling when she tried to sew or hold a book. Yet within her weakness lay a strange clarity. She began to see the house differently, not as a prison, but as a place already steeped in death. The corridors seemed darker, the rooms colder, and in mirrors she caught glimpses of herself that did not look entirely her own. Sometimes the reflection lingered even after she had turned away, a pale figure with hollow eyes watching from the glass. The townsfolk's stories grew more elaborate. Some said they saw Eleanor walking the churchyard at night, her bare feet leaving no prints in the frost. Others claimed the sea grew violent when she wept, waves battering the shore as though echoing her grief. The legend of the cursed bride was no longer only a whisper. It was a certainty in the minds of Whitby's people. Thomas, ever ambitious, twisted these rumors to his advantage. "My wife is not well," he told his creditors, feigning sorrow. "She is touched by something unnatural. It cannot be long now before I am left alone." His false pity earned him more time, more lenience, while Eleanor's suffering deepened. But beneath his smugness, Eleanor saw the crack in his armor. He feared her, not the woman he had married, but the shadow she had become in the eyes of Whitby. Every time a fisherman crossed himself at her passing, every time a child fled from her gaze, Thomas's control slipped further. He had wanted her dead to restore his fortunes, but alive, she was undoing him. It was on a stormy night in late autumn that Eleanor felt the truth settle into her bones. She would not escape Thomas's plan. He would poison her, or strike her, or lock her away until the world forgot her name. But if her death was certain, then perhaps she could shape it. If Whitby already believed she was cursed, then let her curse endure beyond her body. And with that thought, Eleanor ceased to tremble. The storm raged over Whitby like a living beast, tearing at rooftops and lashing the sea into a frenzy. The Whitmore house shook under its fury, its windows rattling as though the very stones wished to break free. Within its walls, Eleanor sat in her chamber, a single candle flickering at her side. She no longer prayed for deliverance. Instead, she listened. To the sea, to the wind, to the beating of her own heart, each sound a thread in the tapestry of her final night. Downstairs, Thomas paced. She could hear his boots striking the floorboards, sharp and deliberate. He muttered to himself, words lost beneath the howl of the storm. At times, his voice rose, filled with laughter that chilled her blood. At others, it fell into a low hiss, as though he spoke to someone unseen. She wondered if guilt had finally cracked his mind, or if some darker presence had come to claim him, as it had sought to claim her. At supper, he brought her wine again. The goblet gleamed in the candlelight, filled to the brim with a liquid darker than blood. He watched her closely, his lips curving in a smile that never reached, his eyes. "To us," he said, raising his own cup. "To the end of misery." Eleanor lifted the goblet, her hand steady despite the storm raging within her veins. She held it to her lips, but before she drank, she met his gaze. For a moment she saw uncertainty flicker there, a flash of doubt in his otherwise cold expression. Then, with deliberate slowness, she set the goblet down untouched. "I will not die by your hand," she whispered. The words seemed to strike him like a blow. His face twisted with rage, and in an instant he lunged across the table, seizing her wrist with such force she cried out, "You will die as I decide." He spat, his breath hot against her cheek. But Eleanor did not cower. Instead, she looked into his eyes and, with a calm born of despair, said, "Then know this. If I die, Whitby will remember me not as your wife, but as the curse that ends you." The storm answered her words. A crash of thunder shook the house, and the candle flames guttered in their holders. Thomas released her wrist, staggering back as though struck not by her strength, but by the weight of her defiance. That night, Eleanor did not sleep. She walked the halls of the house as if they were already her domain beyond death. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch her. The wind whistled through cracks in the windows like a choir of ghosts, and in every shadow she felt the abbey ruins looming. She understood then that she was no longer merely a woman awaiting her end. She was becoming something else, something that would outlast Thomas, outlast the debts, outlast even Whitby itself. By dawn, her mind was clear. She would not flee, nor would she beg. She would let the storm, the sea, and the house bear witness to her final hour, and in that hour, she would claim the name already given to her, the cursed bride of Whitby. The dawn of that storm-laden day arrived without light. The sky above Whitby Abbey was a mass of iron clouds, swollen and restless, as if the heavens themselves prepared for judgment. The townsfolk, uneasy in their homes, whispered that no ship should sail and no man should walk the cliffs, for the storm carried an ill omen. Yet at the Whitmore house, there was no pause, no prayer, only the final tightening of a noose woven from cruelty and desperation. Thomas descended the staircase that morning with a face carved from stone. He wore the same dark coat he had worn on the day of their wedding, though the fabric was frayed and the seams pulled with wear. To him, it was not a garment of memory, but of possession, a mark that bound Eleanor to him as securely as rope binds a prisoner. He found her already waiting in the parlor, seated beside the window where the sea could be seen in violent motion beyond the cliffs. She did not rise when he entered, nor did she flinch as his shadow fell over her. Her stillness unnerved him, for he had grown accustomed to her trembling silence. This was not the silence of fear, but of resolve, and in it he sensed something he could not bend to his will. "You think yourself strong now?" he said, pacing the room with a sneer. "You think this house will protect you? The sea will take you before it shelters you." Eleanor turned her gaze from the window to him, her voice calm, almost otherworldly. "It is not the sea that will remember me, Thomas. It is Whitby. Long after your debts are dust, long after your name is forgotten, mine will linger. Every stone of this house, every wave upon the shore will speak it. The cursed bride, your curse." For a moment, his composure faltered. Rage rose to replace it. He seized her arm, dragging her toward the door, his grip like iron. "Then let Whitby watch as I end it," he hissed. Through the corridor, as they passed, down into the great hall where servants dared not intervene. Their eyes lowered, their bodies pressed against the walls. The storm outside battered the windows, shaking them in their frames. When Thomas forced the door open, the wind howled into the house, carrying the salt of the sea and the cry of gulls fleeing inland. He dragged her across the threshold, out into the storm. Rain lashed against them, soaking Eleanor's dress until it clung to her frail frame. Her hair whipped across her face, yet she did not struggle. She let him pull her toward the cliff's edge, each step taking her closer to the abyss. The sea below roared like 1,000 voices, each wave crashing against the rocks in violent protest. The abbey loomed behind them, its shattered windows like hollow eyes gazing down upon the scene. It was there, at the jagged edge of the cliff, that Thomas released her arm. He stood over her, chest heaving, eyes wild. "Look below, Eleanor," he shouted above the storm. "See the grave that waits for you." She did not look down. She looked only at him. "It is not my grave, Thomas," she said softly, though the wind carried her words. "It is yours." In that instant, lightning split the sky, striking the sea with blinding force. Thomas staggered, raising his arm against the light. Eleanor did not move. The storm seemed to rise in her defense, the waves clawing higher as though the sea itself sought to claim him. His face twisted with fury, and he lunged for her once more. But the earth beneath his boots, softened by rain and trembling with the storm, betrayed him. The cliff crumbled. His cry was torn from his throat, lost to the wind, as his body pitched forward into the void. Eleanor stood unmoved. She watched as the sea swallowed him whole, the black water closing over his form. No hand reached for her. No word of farewell left her lips. She was free, not by escape, but by judgment. When she turned back toward the abbey, she felt the weight of centuries upon her. The storm quieted as though satisfied, and though she still bore the chains of memory, she bore them not as a victim, but as an omen. From that day, the people of Whitby did not call her Eleanor. They called her what the storm had made her, the cursed bride, the woman who had outlasted cruelty, and in whose shadow the abbey's ruins grew darker still. The days that followed Thomas's fall were marked not by mourning, but by whispers. In the taverns and on the docks, men spoke of how the storm had claimed him, though all agreed it was no ordinary gale. Some swore they saw lightning strike only where he stood. Others whispered that the cliff itself had risen against him. None dared to say aloud what many believed, that it was Eleanor's presence, her unyielding gaze, that had called the sea to judgment. When Thomas's body washed ashore days later, broken upon the rocks, the fishermen who found him would not carry him through the town. Instead, they left him at the edge of the abbey grounds, declaring that no man so cursed should pass again through Whitby's gates. His burial was hurried, his grave unmarked. By nightfall, his name had already begun to fade. But Eleanor's remained. She did not flee Whitby as some expected. Instead, she remained in the house on the cliff, alone among its echoing halls. The servants departed one by one, unwilling to serve a mistress whose very silence unsettled them. Yet Eleanor asked for nothing. She lived in solitude, her days marked by the sound of waves breaking against stone, her nights by the tolling of the abbey's ruined bells, though no hand touched their ropes. Children dared one another to climb the hill and glimpse her through the windows. They swore she never aged, that her face remained pale, her eyes hollow but unbroken, like a portrait caught between life and death. Travelers passing through Whitby were told not to look too long upon the house, for if Eleanor's gaze met theirs, they would dream of drowning until their dying day. The years drew on, and still she lingered. Some claimed she was seen walking the cliff's edge on stormy nights, her dress billowing like a torn sail, her hair streaming as though caught by unseen hands. Others swore her shadow stretched across the abbey walls, though she herself was nowhere to be found. In time, the townsfolk gave her no name but one: the cursed bride of Whitby. She was no longer remembered as Eleanor Whitmore, nor as the child stolen by debt, nor as the widow of a cruel husband. She was legend, a warning passed down from mother to child, a story whispered at hearths when the sea roared too loud. Yet beneath the legend lay the truth of her life. A girl sold, a wife humiliated, a widow haunted. And though the world made her into a ghost, she endured not as a spirit of vengeance, but as the echo of every silenced voice, every life reduced to a bargain. The abbey stands still, its stones blackened with centuries, its windows open to the sky. And when storms gather over Whitby, the sea still rises with fury. The fishermen strike their nets, and children shutter their windows, for they say the bride walks once more along the cliffs, her figure framed in lightning, her eyes searching, not for pity, not for redemption, but for remembrance. And so the tale concludes, not with peace, but with a name carried by wind and wave alike: the cursed bride of Whitby.